Our winter getaway to the remote forests of northern Minnesota was supposed to be a peaceful escape from our hectic city lives. My friends, Sarah, Alex, Mark, Emily, and I rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization. We were looking forward to a week of relaxation, snow-covered adventures, in the warmth of a crackling fireplace. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The cabin, cozy and rustic, sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. We spent our days hiking through the snow-laden forest and our nights gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The silence of the wilderness was a welcome contrast to the constant noise of the city. But on the fourth day, a massive snowstorm rolled in, trapping us inside the cabin. At first, it was an exciting change of pace. We had plenty of supplies, and the storm gave us an excuse to stay inside, play games, and tell ghost stories by the fire. It was during one of these storytelling sessions that Alex brought up the legend of the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a creature from Algonquian folklore, Alex began, his voice taking on a serious tone. It's said to be a malevolent spirit that possesses people, driving them to commit acts of cannibalism. The Wendigo itself is emaciated, with glowing eyes and long, sharp teeth. It's always hungry, always searching for its next victim. We laughed it off, treating it as just another creepy campfire tale. But as the night wore on and the wind howled outside, a sense of unease settled over us. There was something about the way Alex told the story, the conviction in his eyes that made it feel all too real. The storm raged for 3 days straight. By the second day, the cabin, which had seemed so cozy, now felt claustrophobic. Tensions began to rise and small arguments broke out over trivial things. By the third day, we were all on edge. That night, as we huddled around the fire, we heard it, a distant, mournful wail that sent chills down our spines. At first, we thought it was the wind, but then we heard it again, closer this time. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a mix of human and animal, filled with a deep, insatiable hunger. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "but we need to stay inside." Alex, however, seemed to have a different idea. "We should check it out," he said, standing up. "Maybe someone needs help." "Are you crazy?" Mark shot back. "We're in the middle of a snowstorm. It could be dangerous." But Alex was already putting on his coat, determination in his eyes. "I'm going. You can stay here if you want." Reluctantly, I agreed to go with him. I couldn't let him go out there alone. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out into the storm, the icy wind cutting through our clothes like knives. The others stayed behind, watching us with a mix of fear and concern. We trudged through the snow, following the sound of the wail. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest. As we moved further away from the cabin, the trees closed in around us, their branches heavy with snow. The world felt smaller, more oppressive. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood a figure, hunched and emaciated, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was the Wendigo, just as Alex had described. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Alex took a step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "It's real," he whispered. "Oh my God, it's real." The Wendigo turned its gaze towards us, and I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror wash over me. Its eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I knew in that moment that we were not going to make it out of there alive. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Alex's arm and pulling him back towards the cabin. We sprinted through the snow, the Wendigo's wails echoing behind us. I could hear it crashing through the forest, getting closer with each passing second. We burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind us. The others looked at us in shock, but there was no time to explain. "We need to barricade the door," I gasped, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Now!" Everyone sprang into action, piling furniture against the door and windows. We could hear the Wendigo outside, its wails turning into furious growls. It pounded on the walls, trying to break in. For hours, we huddled together, listening to the creature's relentless assault. It was as if the storm had given it strength, and it was determined to get to us. Just when I thought the walls would give way, the sound stopped. An eerie silence fell over the cabin. We waited, not daring to move or make a sound. The storm outside had finally subsided, and the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the cracks in the windows. Cautiously, we unbarricaded the door and stepped outside. There was no sign of the Wendigo, but the forest felt different, as if it were holding its breath. We decided to leave the cabin that day, not wanting to risk another encounter. The journey back to civilization was long and arduous, but we made it. The ride back to the nearest town was a silent one. The weight of what we had experienced hung heavily in the air. Each of us was lost in our thoughts, replaying the events of the night over and over again. It wasn't until we reached the safety of the small town that we began to speak, trying to make sense of the terror that had befallen us. Mark suggested we stop at a local diner to gather our thoughts and maybe find someone who could help us understand what had happened. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals scattered at the bar and booths. We took a corner booth, our haggard appearance drawing curious glances from the patrons. As we sipped our coffee, Alex recounted the story of the Wendigo to the waitress, who had shown a keen interest in our tale. Her face paled as she listened, and she nodded slowly. "I've heard of the Wendigo," she said quietly. "My grandmother used to tell us kids to stay out of the woods at night, especially in the winter. She always said the Wendigo roams when the hunger is strongest." Her words sent another chill down my spine. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked. "Any way to protect ourselves?" The waitress shook her head. "Once the Wendigo has marked you, it's hard to escape its hunger. Your best bet is to leave the area and never come back. Some say it's a curse that follows you if you give in to its call." Leaving the area was exactly what we planned to do. We paid for our meal and left the diner, the sense of unease following us. The drive back to the city was tense, each of us casting nervous glances at the woods lining the highway, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. Back in the city, life slowly returned to normal. We tried to put the events of the trip behind us, burying ourselves in work and routine. But the memories of that night in the cabin lingered, haunting our dreams and creeping into our thoughts at unexpected moments. A few weeks later, Alex called us together. He had been doing research on the Wendigo, trying to understand more about the creature and the curse it carried. "I found something," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and fear. "There are stories of people who survived encounters with the Wendigo. They say you have to confront it, face your fear, and banish it with a ritual." "Are you serious?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "You want to go back?" "It's the only way," Alex insisted. "We can't keep living like this, always looking over our shoulders. If we don't do something, it will haunt us forever." Reluctantly, we agreed. It was a desperate plan, but we had to try. Armed with Alex's research and a newfound determination, we made preparations for our return to the cabin. The journey back to the silent hills was filled with a sense of dread. The cabin looked just as we had left it, standing ominously against the backdrop of the dense forest. We arrived just before dusk, setting up camp outside the cabin, unwilling to step back inside its walls until necessary. As darkness fell, we gathered around a fire, the ritual Alex had found laid out before us. It involved a series of chants, offerings, and symbols meant to banish the Wendigo and break its curse. We were skeptical, but what other choice did we have? We began the ritual, our voices trembling as we chanted the ancient words. The forest around us seemed to grow darker, the air colder. The sense of unease grew, and then we heard it, the same mournful wail that had haunted us that night. The Wendigo emerged from the shadows, its emaciated form even more horrifying than I remembered. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring our fear. We continued the ritual, our voices growing louder, more desperate. The Wendigo paused, its glowing eyes fixed on us. For a moment, I thought it was working. But then, with a guttural roar, it lunged at us. The fire flared up, blinding us momentarily. When our vision cleared, the Wendigo was gone. We stood in stunned silence, the only sound our ragged breathing. Had it worked? Had we banished the Wendigo? The forest was silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. "We did it," Alex said, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. We actually did it. We gathered our things and left the cabin, not daring to look back. The drive back to the city was filled with a cautious hope. Maybe we had finally escaped the Wendigo's curse. Years have passed since that night. We've all moved on with our lives, but the memory of the Wendigo still lingers. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, I'll hear a distant wail and wonder if we truly escaped. The legend of the Wendigo is a reminder that some horrors are real, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I had always been drawn to the Cascade Mountains. They were a place of adventure, solace, and mystery. As a child, I spent countless hours exploring the dense forest that covered the mountain range. My fascination with the wilderness grew with me, and as an adult, I became a forest ranger, dedicating my life to protecting and preserving the wilderness I love so much. One winter, an unusually harsh storm swept through the region, leaving the forest buried under a thick blanket of snow. It was during this storm that reports started coming in about a series of strange occurrences. Locals claimed to have seen a gaunt figure lurking at the edge of the woods, and there were whispers of a haunting wail that carried on the wind during the dead of night. At first, I dismissed these stories as mere superstition, but as more and more reports came in, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate the sightings myself. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sky already darkening with the promise of another snowfall. I hiked deep into the forest, the snow crunching under my boots and my breath visible in the cold air. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After several hours of trekking, I reached a small clearing. The snow here was undisturbed, save for a set of tracks leading deeper into the woods. They were unlike any animal tracks I had ever seen, long and thin, with deep claw marks. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the tracks, each step filling me with a growing sense of dread. As I ventured further, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches heavy with snow. The air grew colder, and the faint light of the setting sun barely penetrated the dense canopy. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a low, mournful wail that sent chills down my spine. I froze, my senses on high alert. The wail came again, closer this time. It was a sound filled with an insatiable hunger, a deep, primal need. I turned slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and emaciated, its skin stretched taut over protruding bones. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The creature watched me with a predatory intensity, and I knew without a doubt that I was looking at the Wendigo. I took a step back, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that turning my back on the creature could be fatal. Slowly, I began to back away, never taking my eyes off the Wendigo. It followed my movements, its eyes never leaving mine. As I reached the edge of the clearing, the Wendigo let out another wail, louder and more desperate. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I could hear the Wendigo behind me, its wails growing more frantic with each step. I burst through the trees and into a small, frozen stream. My feet slipped on the ice and I fell hard, the cold seeping into my bones. I scrambled to my feet and looked back, but the Wendigo was gone. The forest was silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. I made my way back to the ranger station, my mind reeling from the encounter. I couldn't shake the image of the Wendigo from my mind, its glowing eyes and jagged teeth haunting my thoughts. I knew that I had to warn the others, to let them know that the legend of the Wendigo was real. Over the following weeks, I shared my story with anyone who would listen. Some believed me, while others dismissed it as the ravings of a man who had spent too much time alone in the woods. But I knew what I had seen, and the fear it instilled in me was very real. One evening, as I was closing up the ranger station, I heard the wail again, It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The forest loomed dark and silent before me. I followed the sound, each step filled with a sense of dread. The wail grew louder, more desperate, leading me deeper into the woods. I knew I should turn back, but something compelled me to keep going. As I reached the clearing where I had first seen the Wendigo, the wail stopped. I shone my flashlight around, my breath visible in the cold air. The clearing was empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw them. Glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. The Wendigo stepped into the light, its form even more terrifying than I remembered. It let out a low growl, and I knew I was out of time. I ran, my legs burning with the effort, the Wendigo's wails echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the ranger station. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here knowing the Wendigo was out there hunting. I packed my things and left the next morning, leaving behind the forest I had loved all my life. The legend of the Wendigo was real, and I had no intention of becoming its next victim. I moved to the outskirts of a small town, far from the Cascade Mountains. For a while, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I found work at a local hardware store and tried to push the memories of the Wendigo out of my mind. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Then one night I heard it again. The same mournful wail that had haunted me in the woods. It was faint, carried on the wind but unmistakable. Panic surged through me. How could it have found me here? Desperation drove me to research more about the Wendigo, hoping to find some way to protect myself. I scoured old folklore books and obscure internet forums, piecing together fragments of information. The more I learned, the more hopeless it seemed. The Wendigo was a creature of insatiable hunger, an embodiment of the darkest human instincts. One particular piece of information stood out. A ritual said to banish the Wendigo. It involved creating a circle of protection using a mix of sage and salt, lighting a sacred fire, and reciting an ancient chant. It sounded like something out of a movie, but I was willing to try anything. I gathered the necessary materials and waited for the night, my heart pounding with anticipation. As the sun set and the shadows lengthened, I prepared the ritual. I created the circle of sage and salt, lit the fire, and began to chant. At first, nothing happened, but then the air grew colder and the fire flickered ominously. The wail echoed through the night, louder and more insistent. The Wendigo emerged from the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I continued to chant, my voice trembling with fear. The Wendigo approached the circle, its movements slow and deliberate. It stopped at the edge of the circle, unable to cross the barrier. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe the ritual was working. But then the Wendigo let out a furious roar, and the fire suddenly went out. The circle of protection crumbled, and the creature lunged at me. I scrambled back, my mind racing. I needed to finish the ritual, but the Wendigo was too close. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a handful of salt and threw it at the creature. The Wendigo recoiled, hissing in pain. Taking advantage of the moment, I relit the fire and continued the chant. The Wendigo thrashed and wailed, but it couldn't break through the barrier. Slowly the creature began to fade, its form dissolving into the darkness. The wail grew fainter until it was nothing more than a whisper on the wind. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with relief. The Wendigo was gone, but I knew I couldn't stay. The ritual had worked, but only just. The creature would return, driven by its insatiable hunger. I needed to keep moving, never staying in one place for too long. Years have passed since that night. I've become a wanderer, always on the move, never letting my guard down. The legend of the Wendigo is a constant reminder that some horrors are real, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as long as the hunger exists, the Wendigo will continue to haunt the wilderness, a silent predator in the night.